Good afternoon, I'm Brent, Holland. Welcome to the show. This afternoon, Mark Zuehlke, author of Juno Beach and the Gothic Line. Today we discuss his new book, Holding Juno. Mark Zuehlke, as you know, is continuing his seminal research, an incredible writer, bringing us true stories of Canada's heroic defense of the D-Day beaches post-D-Day, June 7th to 12th, 1944. It has been said of Mark Zuehlke that he's emerged as Canada's preeminent writer of popular history. Holding Juno, the follow-up to Juno Beach, only confirms that accolade.
Imagine coming off one of those landing craft and then that long dash across naked sand. There's German pillboxes all over in front of you. All of the veterans who talk about that day when they came out of the boat, they could see just a line running across the entire width of the beach ahead of them, and the flickering flash of the machine guns firing. And they knew their only way of surviving is they had to get to the walls. These were the big walls behind that kept the sea out during storms. So there's storm walls that are built into the beach, and they had to get to those. And that's a distance of 200 to 300 to 400 yards, depending on where you came ashore. So that's like a pretty long golf course link, one hole that you've got to run across in deep sand as well. So your shoes are sinking into the sand and you're carrying about 110 pounds of equipment on your back. So it wasn't really a run, it was more like a stumble. And they had to get across that. And you look at that and you think, well, I think everybody's reaction is the same as, my God, how did they do it?
Yeah.
And that's the impression that stays with you. And then you go to Benny-sur-Mer, the cemetery, where all the Canadians are buried who died that day. And it's an incredibly powerful experience as you walk from one grave to another and see how young they were.
Yeah.
And the little towns they came from. And you just really come away with a very different impression of that generation that went away to a war that so many of them didn't come back from.
This afternoon, Mark Zuehlke, Holding Juno, Canada's heroic defense of the D-Day beaches, June 7th to 12th, 1944, right now on Brent, Holland. Folks, if you're just joining us, we're speaking with Mark Zuehlke. He's the author of Juno Beach and the Gothic Line, and the book I'm holding in my hand right now is called Holding Juno. Now, Mark has been called Canada's preeminent writer of popular history, and for good reason. I've read the book myself, and he really does do justice to those who fought for us, going back to D-Day on the shores of Normandy. Mark, I was wondering if we could start off, if you could tell the students that are listening right now, because primarily my demographic is university students. I was wondering if you could tell them how important D-Day was and maybe just set it up a little bit, and then we'll go on to some of the stories in Holding Juno.
Sure. D-Day was extremely important. It was basically the seminal moment in the Western Allies campaign against Germany in World War II. So what you had up until that moment was a war that was being fought on two fronts, but primarily being fought by the Russians in the Eastern Front. We were fighting them, the Germans, in Italy, but it was impossible to make that a significant battlefield that would actually bring about closure and the victory over Germany. And so instead, the Allies in the West always knew that they had to make a landing somewhere on the main part of the European continent. So they had to land either in France or in Belgium or Holland, and then fight their way into Germany and march effectively to Berlin to end the war. And so June 6, 1944 is when the Western Allies finally are able to launch this invasion onto the Normandy coast. And basically, all of their eggs are in that basket. If they didn't get onto the sand that day on June 6, 1944, and were thrown back into the sea, they knew that it would be another year to 2 years before they could bring the resources together again to try one more time to do this. So they had to succeed with this invasion. And so June 6th, they managed to fight their way onto the sand with 5 divisions attacking, one of which was the Canadian 3rd Division that landed at Juno Beach, and they're right in the center. The Juno Beach attack by 3rd Canadian Division is one of the most significant operations that Canadian forces are involved in the course of World War II.
And as I read in your book, Canadians were the ones that actually made their way the furthest inland that day. And that's quite an achievement.
Yes, and especially in the intensity of the fighting that day can't be understated. When they hit the beach, 3rd Division, the first leading wave that came ashore in 3 different points, 3 small communities that are close together, all stretching along what is now known as Juno Beach. The casualties that they took just getting out of the water, they plunged out into deep water and had to wade through the water under heavy machine gun fire, artillery fire coming from bunkers all laid along the beach. They lost a lot of men just getting onto the sand, and then they had to gain control of these 3 little towns. And only after that, and it's about 1 p.m. in the afternoon, do they start actually moving inland. And they managed to move 6 miles and some inland, achieving a penetration well beyond what the Americans and British on either of their flanks were able to do. Most of them, those divisions, the 2 American and 2 British divisions, none of them got more than about 3 miles inland. So they almost doubled the depth of the penetration, which was quite remarkable.
What was in front of them? What kind of ominous forces had Nazi Germany put in front of them? Now, I have heard a lot of people say that, the only thing in front of them were a bunch of kids. Nothing could be further from the truth. They were Nazi Hitler Youth fanatics.
That's right. The initial defenses were a division called the Coastal Division. So they weren't extremely well trained. They were trained in defense. And so they weren't able to quickly adapt once they were rooted out of their bunkers. But their role was to defend, and they were trained well in that. They were trained to stay in their bunkers and fight to the conclusion when they were overrun. And they did that. So the Canadians fight through that, and then they start pushing inland. And as they're pushing inland, coming up towards them, racing from positions that were further back, was particularly the 12th SS Hitler Youth Division. These were really tough troops. They ranged in age from 15 as a low to about 21, the average soldiers. Their sergeants were all older and had all seen intense fighting as SS troops in the Russian front, as had also their officers. So they had very, very crack leadership and also quite fanatical leadership. The fighting on the Russian front had hardened those officers and sergeants to such a point that killing prisoners and other such incidences are just an accepted way of doing war. The youth themselves have never lived they've lived almost their entire lives under Hitler's Nazi regime. That's all they knew. That's all they had any knowledge of, was that experience. They're totally fanatically trained and indoctrinated. So you've got fanatics under extremely competent and extremely hard leadership, and they were also quite well trained. The Hitler Youth had been training before the war. A lot of these kids, they were being trained as military soldiers from the time that they were 12, 13 years old. So they've been trained for a long, long time. They're totally indoctrinated to believe in themselves as the Superman. There was a lot of Nietzschean philosophy in the Nazi ideology. And amongst that was a belief that Aryan superiority, but also that the Hitler Youth were the embodiment of the Superman, that they almost couldn't be killed. They were so good and so skilled as soldiers and stuff. So they come in with really extremely high level of attitude, basically, that they're going to be tough. They're going to overwhelm these Canadians, and they're just going to shove them back into the sea.
I was surprised to learn also that before the Hitler Youth, in fact, the scouting system was abolished, and then the Hitler Youth came in, and all the youth were forced to go into the Hitler Youth. I was really surprised to learn that, how integrated that Nazi ideology was. And you're quite right about the Superman. It seemed that they all thought they were invulnerable, completely invulnerable. You had mentioned before that there were some atrocities committed by German officers. One of the atrocities, and there was legion, folks, was something called Place des 37 Canadiens, or Place of 37 Canadians. I was wondering if you could tell the folks what happened there.
What we have happen is in the days that immediately follow June 6th, where you have 6 days basically, June 7th to June 12th. The Canadians had pushed, as we said earlier, in 6 miles. So June 7th, the Germans respond with a heavy, massive counterattack against the Canadian forces. And that's where the Hitler Youth strike. And the intention at that point is to drive the Canadians right back into the sea. The Germans have correctly realized that Juno Beach is the key to the Normandy invasion, that if they could drive Canada back into the sea, they would have split the British from the Americans, and they could then attack outward on their flank, basically roll up each beach one after the other, and defeat the invasion. So Canada's at the pinnacle, the Canadian forces are at the pinnacle of the German attack. They put their biggest and best Panzer divisions against them, and that's the Hitler Youth, and another one called the 25th Panzer Division, and another one called Panzer Lehr. So you got 3 divisions directed against the Canadians, who have approximately 10,000 troops on the ground at that time. So they're actually outnumbered. On June 7th, the Hitler Youth strike heavily against a group of Canadians that are actually advancing at that time, basically roll them up. There's a little town called OT, and the Royal Winnipeg Rifles and not the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, it's the
North Nova Scotians, wasn't it?
North Nova Scotia Highlanders, yes, thank you.
No problem. That's okay. There's a lot of information in this book, folks, and he does complete justice. He really does. It's impeccably researched, and I urge you all to go and get it. Now back to Mark. Forgive me for interrupting.
Oh, that's just fine. So there's the 2 towns, there's the OT and Buron, and the North Nova Scotia Highlanders are pushing through there, and they get struck just basically overwhelmed by this massive assault from the 12th SS. And the large number of the troops are taken prisoner, about 120 roughly are taken prisoner, and of those, and they're not all North Nova Scotia Highlanders, but a lot of them are, the majority of them are over the course of the day at various points, they're basically put up against walls and shot by groups of Hitler and SS under the direction of various commanders, including an incident at the main headquarters of the 12th SS, where a fellow called Kurt Meyer, who was the general commanding, says basically about a bunch of prisoners, get rid of them, and then says, well, I didn't mean for them to be shot, but they are taken out and executed, and they're among the ones that are killed that day. And so a pattern develops where we start seeing various Canadian troops being in various places being taken prisoner, and thinking that the rules were that if you surrendered, you were supposed to be moved to the back and then sent back to a concentration camp. So that people are surrendering in good faith, expecting that they're going to survive, and they're then effectively murdered.
Folks, if you're just joining us, we're speaking with Mark Zuehlke. And Mark Zuehlke, of course, is the author of the best-selling book Juno Beach and also The Gothic Climb. The book we're discussing today is called Holding Juno. And this takes place on the 2nd day right up to the 7th day. Right after they've conquered the beach, they have to move inland. And this is where the meat of the fighting, and it was on a pivotal point at that point, whether we were actually going to be able to hold that ground or not. It was really, really tedious. And as Mark's been describing, horrible, horrible fighting with atrocities. What you're going to find in this book, and what I found revealing in this book, is how everyday Canadians rose to the task and beyond to beat back the Nazis. Just ordinary people that you would see in the street join the army, and they just went over and beat them back. It was a professional army to a certain degree, but it was made up primarily of just everyday folks. And this is something that I want entrenched to everybody that's listening, because it's important that we do justice and honor to these folks that went over there to fight for our freedom. I was wondering if we could continue with a few more of the stories that took place. There was no defensive plan to repel the Allies if they went inland. The idea was to stop them sharply on the beaches, but they did manage to get inland. Who was in charge of that? I know you had mentioned Kurt Meyer, but Rommel, who was the overall general in charge, was back in Berlin, if I'm not mistaken, suffering from an ear infection, wasn't he?
Yes. Rommel had gone back to Berlin and was actually in a community outside of Berlin. That was where his wife and his family resided. So he wasn't expecting the invasion. That was the thing. We did totally catch the Germans by surprise with the invasion on June 6th. They weren't anticipating it at all. And so there was a great scramble to recover. And the strategy had been, primarily because of Hitler's insistence, the strategy had been very much that they would stop the Allies right on the beaches, and that's where the victory had to be achieved. And there was no expectation that it wouldn't be achieved and that the Allies would fight their way inland. So once it becomes clear the Allies are moving inland, the Germans have to scramble to recover. With Rommel not there, there are some delays, and there were delays from also getting Hitler to authorize the release of the major panzer divisions, which were all held back, not being expected to be involved in the initial fighting. So that permission was finally given sort of midday, June 7th, and that's why it was later in the day on June 7th when the Germans finally, the 12th SS and the Panzer Lehr, arrive and start to drive the Canadians back. And your point about the Canadians being just average citizens is a really good one. The Canadian Army is actually the only entirely volunteer army in the Allied forces, and that's something that we often forget. The American Army and the British Army, particularly both of them, were dependent on conscription to fill their ranks. Canada had conscription, but we had a policy that we didn't, the conscripted soldiers would not be sent overseas. They were held back here in Canada for defensive duties of defending the country against the possibilities of attack from Japan or Germany via various means that never developed. So the Canadians who went overseas were all volunteers, and they came from every walk of life. They weren't professional soldiers. At the beginning of the war, we had an army of just a few thousand men. So that was a little cadre that the army could be built up from. But everybody who came in, including most of the officers, were just regular people. And the other thing that was really interesting about the Canadian system is we had a regimental formed by territory through the militia. So when you're looking at the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, for example, as a regiment, it was made up of people at that time who all came from the little communities in northern Nova Scotia. So they knew each other, and they all went off to war together. In one case, one company, the company commander was the high school teacher, a principal, I should say, of their high school. And all the men in the company, most of them, were young men who had just graduated from high school, so they knew their officer who was commanding them as the principal that they'd gone to this school. So it was a very tight community. And you had this for everyone. The 48 Highlanders of Canada, for example, all came from Toronto. And Toronto wasn't the huge city it is today, so people knew each other. And that made a big difference, because you were not just fighting for your country, you were also fighting for your friends and relatives. They were often brothers.
That's right.
The classic story of the Dalton brothers, for example, of the Queen's Own Rifles. There's two companies of the Queen's Own Rifles in the leading wave that hits Juno Beach, and they're Elliot and Charlie Dalton. They're brothers. they shake hands on the deck of the ship before they go away, and they're both expecting to never see the other one again because the odds of two company commanders living through the landing was very slight.
It's very gripping, your book. I grew up in a city, I'm in Sudbury right now, but I grew up in a city called Verdun, which is a suburb of Montreal. And I know on a per capita basis, I think Canada sent the most troops overseas. And on a per capita basis, Verdun sent the most citizens to become those troops. And I know it's always been ingrained in our family about service. And I know I had great uncles that fought in the war. I had a great grandfather who actually fought in the Boer War. He fought in the First World War, tried to get into the Second World War, but he was a little bit on the older side, so they wouldn't let him. He had 7 kids at home, and his wife used to say that he used to cause wars just so he could get away. But this is the camaraderie. You talk about brothers and that. 3 brothers actually went off to war from the Best family. I want to mention them. Patricia Best is my great aunt, and her 3 of the brothers went off to war, and thank God they all came home okay. Some were wounded.
Quite surprising, actually.
Absolutely, very much so. And this is something I'm trying to get through to the students, that we should be so grateful for these folks that went overseas, because it really was life hanging in the balance at this point. Let's go back to the book. Folks, if you're just joining us, let me just tell you about this great book. Holding Juno. Our guest today, Mark Zuehlke, award-winning author of Juno Beach, Gothic Line, and so many other great books, doing great justice to our heroic boys and women overseas. One of the stories, and I'm just going to read a quote from the book if you don't mind, and then you could tell the story. I'm kind of coming in at the end, but this is so funny when I read this. It deals with a bemused Brown wondered how one ignored enemy tanks. I was uncertain and very apprehensive. The prospect of being attacked by a bunch of marauding panthers was almost beyond my comprehension, especially since we had no tank support of our own. Now, this is a really funny story. I'm not sure if you recall it or not. I was wondering if you do recall it, if you could tell the folks.
Yes, that's Pardonville Farm, I believe.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Yes, outside of, and so it's really Regina Rifles. And they had been surrounded. Cartonville Farm is outside of Nori-on-Bassam, which was a little village that the majority of the regiment had holed up in this village. The farm was considered a key point to protecting the right flank, because it's on the edge of the right side of the village. And Major Brown is the company commander. He's got it would have been only about 50 men with him at that time because of the casualties they had suffered during the first day and a half of the fighting. And they've got a couple of machine guns, and then the rest of them just their light weapons. And Hitler Youth attack at night on June 8th, I think it was. And they come in, and they've got tanks, lots of them. And he can hear these tanks rolling around on the edges around the farm. And all they need to do is turn their guns on the farm, and it's game over for Brown and his company. He manages to establish contact with the division, with his battalion commander, who patches him through to an artillery officer. And they finally agree that the only solution is to just plaster the place, farm included, because he can't give direct coordinates for artillery barrage to be brought against the tanks, because they're out there milling around the farm and firing on it and stuff from out of the darkness, so he can't see where they are at any given moment. And so they just saturate the area with about 2 artillery battalions firing all of their guns, just shelling it heavily. And what he does is he pulls all his men into the stone building that is the heart of the farm, and they basically hide inside the stone building, which is able to withstand having some shells hit it. And so the shelling comes down, and it succeeded in basically surprising the Germans to the extent that all these tanks withdrew and pulled back. And Major Brown and his small and very brave group of Canadians were saved as a result.
Incredible story, isn't it? Let me ask you, Mark, what were some of the challenges you faced in researching this book?
Well, the biggest challenge always is, particularly with Holding Juno, was the events of June 7th to June 12th had been completely overshadowed by the sheer immensity of the story of June 6th, the D-Day invasion. And I fell victim to this myself. I thought that I would do Juno Beach would encompass June 6th to June 12th, and that there would all be one book. And I'm writing away, and I'm halfway through the book, and I'm still in June 6th, and my deadline was coming up. And so I actually ended up phoning my publisher and saying, the June 6th story is huge. So what do you think about, I'll just do June 6th as one book, and that'll be Juno Beach. And then we'll do a book on June 7th to 12th. And luckily, he agreed. And that put me in a unique position that no Canadian historian had ever found themselves in before. And that was, I could actually concentrate on June 7th to 12th as an independent story. Mm-hmm. Previously, it had always been basically an end note to the June 6th story. It was sort of like, we got ashore, and then a bunch of fighting happened on June 7th to 12th, which we won. Was kind of, because everyone had run out of words, basically. The books would be so huge. So there was this tendency to concentrate the story on winning the beach, which made sense because it's so incredibly dramatic and a huge undertaking. And it's the pivotal battle of the war, if you really look at it. When we won the battle on June 6th and we're ashore, at that point, Germany is going to lose the war. It was an inevitability almost.
Precisely.
Unless they turned around in June 7th to 12th and had succeeded in driving us back into the water. And that's what I realized when I started it on Holding Juno, is that those 6 days were also pivotal in that we defeated the counterattacks that were intended to throw us back into the sea. And once June 12th rolled around and the Germans were spent and there was no longer any question that they could throw us back into the sea, then the war was effectively won. It just then required another year and a half of marching and fighting to get to the point where they defeated the German forces and brought the war to an end. But there was never a question that Germany could win the war after June 12th. They were going to lose the war. They just didn't realize it themselves.
And you bring up an essential point, that pivotal moment, because a couple of years before that, something called Dieppe had happened. And I was wondering if you could give an overview of what happened at Dieppe and why it was so crucial to hang on to that land and what a risk we were taking.
Yes. Well, and Dieppe was the thing that haunted the Allies all the time they were getting ready for the invasion of Normandy. They were constantly looking back at Dieppe and saying, what if we have another Dieppe? If this happens, how do we get ashore without having another Dieppe is almost the question. And Dieppe, of course, was an attempt to land Canadian troops and some British and American troops, primarily all Canadians, 2nd Canadian Division and the Calgary Armored Regiment. And they tried to put 6,000 men ashore at a town called Dieppe, which is in northern France. And the idea was that they were going to conduct a major raid, and they were going to take out some radar stations that were monitoring the Allied bomber forces as they were going inland. But it was also a dress rehearsal for could the Allies pull off an amphibious invasion of the mainland of Europe? That's what they wanted to see. So on July 2nd, 1942, 6,000 men, almost 5,000 of them are Canadians, attempt to land at Dieppe. The landing was a complete disaster. They had the Germans were ready for them. The Germans knew they were coming, and they came ashore and were basically slaughtered on the beach. You have, of the 5,000 Canadians who landed, about 2,200 returned to Britain. The other 3,300, you've got 1,000 of them, roughly 901 to be exact, are killed, and 1,946 are taken prisoner. By any yardstick, the Dieppe attack was a disaster and a huge failure. They didn't achieve any of their objectives. They couldn't get off the beach. They didn't achieve anything, really. But what they did achieve out of the disaster was that the Allies were then able to sit down, Canadians and British and Americans, and take apart that operation and decide from what went wrong how they could do it better. And that's where the work begins towards the invasion of Normandy. And they learned a lot, and they didn't make the same kind of mistakes again. They learned that for example, that they couldn't get tanks ashore by just taking them in landing craft and dumping them on the beach. For the invasion of Normandy, they developed tanks that were amphibious themselves and could just motor through the water and get onto the sand on their own without depending on a ship. They learned not to land where there was gravel, pebble rock on the beach itself, because at Dieppe, that's what they landed onto, what was called chert, and it broke the tracks of the tanks. The tanks never got off the beach because their tracks were all broken. So they learned not to do that. So they picked Juno Beach, and all the other beaches were picked exclusively in one case because of the fact that it was sand that they would be landing on, and the tanks would be able to roll right across that without any trouble and get inland. So they learned a lot of these kind of things, and they learned that they really had to be good about security, that they had to achieve surprise. If the Germans were expecting them to land and knew they were coming, then they were going to probably get defeated. So the amount of secretiveness around the Normandy invasion was huge. We had Operation Avalanche, where they created a complete false army under General George Patton.
Oh, that's what it was called. I never knew that's what it was called. Okay.
Yeah. So here you have a fake army, basically. Established in southern England to make the Germans think that the invasion's going to come in another area. And you have a lot of that kind of planning and preparation. You have the airborne landings inland to create chaos of the Germans. So a lot of that planning and the way that the invasion was carried out would probably not have been carried out that well had it not been for the Dieppe operation before it.
Folks, our guest today, Mark Zuehlke, his book Holding Juno, and of course you've heard of his other book, Juno Beach and the Gothic Line. His book can be gotten at Chapters Indigo right across the country, or simply just go to the www.brenthollandshow.com website. Click on the book cover as always. We'll take you to Chapters Indigo online where you can order it from the comfort of your own home. It's an astounding book. It feels like you're right there, right alongside these brave soldiers of ours. Do you feel, Mark, that the Canadian contribution has been understated over the years?
Yes, it's been terribly understated. By American and British historians, it's mostly just ignored.
I noticed that.
You see that even today, the most recent book that came out, Anthony Beevor's book on D-Day, the Canadians get very scant mention in it. And, with the histories before that by Max Hastings and John Keegan and, not John Keegan, Max Hastings and Cornelius Ryan, that they just aren't given much attention at all. And that continues to be the case with Canadian participation in World War II on all fronts, it seems. Which is one of the reasons I got into doing what I'm doing. The whole Canadian Battle series is because I felt we had to bring the Canadian story out of the mists of being ignored, and put it out there front and center into the Canadian consciousness. And within Canada, too, it's not a story that's been well told or told in much detail. Holding Juno, for example, the incidences of those 6 days, nobody had ever really written about them in any detail before. And I keep finding that and being surprised as I go along to do other campaigns about how little has been written about some of these campaigns and the sacrifices in the end that a whole generation made on behalf of their fellow citizens in the world.
Were you able to, let me ask it this way, did any of the stories or perhaps one of the people involved in those stories emerge more one above the other? Was there one story in particular that you kind of encompass as very representative of the post-landing battles?
I think the main ones, there was an officer who was in the North Nova Scotia Highlanders.
I'm looking too.
Major Don Laramont.
Yeah.
Yeah. For Holding Juno, I didn't get to interview Major Laramont. He was living in Ontario, and he wasn't in very good health to do an interview with me by phone. It's sometimes veterans just can't deal with that. But a fellow in Ontario went and on my behalf and interviewed him at quite some length. And then I had quite a bit of correspondence from Don Laramont as well. He had written some accounts of his experiences some years ago, back in, it would have been in the early 1980s when his memory was still really good. And I found his story was, because I had a lot of detail in his story. I had from his experiences of why he enlisted and how he went about enlisting, and was able to trace him, bring him forward as a character through the whole book, who we could see his story. And he was one of the commanders of one of the companies that was overrun that day by the 12th SS. He was taken prisoner. He was almost murdered, but not. And then he manages to escape from a train that the Germans put him on, that is running him up north to a concentration camp, and actually was able to return to the regiment and continued to serve with it after that. So I thought his story was a very pivotal one, and a real story of courage, leadership, and resilience, and his ability to quickly adapt to a whole number of scenarios, like coming ashore, the vicious fight to establish themselves on the beach. He handled that extremely well. Then he leads the men inland, and he's running that part of the battle extremely well. Then suddenly everything goes south for them, and the Germans surround them, and he is able to maintain some control of the company even as it surrenders, and maintain some control of the men to try and keep them from getting into this situation as he realizes that the SS are completely out of control, that these kids are just, are willy-nilly killing people. And as a result, he was able, I think he saved the lives of a good number of his men who would have been killed otherwise if he hadn't handled himself so professionally and competently. And then, he manages to escape from the Germans and get back. It's just quite an amazing man.
Should be a movie. Should be a movie. In the States it would be.
A lot of movies here.
Folks, sure, please go ahead.
True. That's very true. We've so many of these stories that I've written, when I look at them, they're the kind of story that should be a movie. And if we had the kind of funding and the film industry that, say, Australia has, they probably, some of them would have made it into movies by now. These stories of these individuals and their incredibly brave and incredible experiences.
The book, folks, is packed full of these types of stories. And just on that movie theme, I had an opportunity a couple of years ago when Passchendaele was just released to speak with... Thank you very much. And he said his toughest problem with the movie was finding the funding. He said he basically had to go back and forth across the country a zillion times to find the money for it. And it's unfortunate because these are huge pieces of our Canadian culture, our Canadian history that should be brought forth to the public, especially in this day and age with the terrorist thing going on day in, day out. Just to let people know that we have been through something similar before, and there's a precedent that Canadians are brave and Canadians will survive and carry forward. Mark, I want to ask you, I know you've been over to Juno Beach.
Mm-hmm.
When you're on the shore looking inland, I imagine that you probably try to imagine in your head what it was like for those folks. Is it daunting when you look from the edge of the beach in towards the town?
It really is. When you're standing on the sand looking at either of the three towns, and it's changed somewhat, but it hasn't changed much. The beach is a little narrower than it used to be, which is a sobering thought because you look at it and it looks pretty darn wide at this point. And you imagine coming off of one of those landing craft and then that long dash across naked sand. There's German pillboxes all over in front of you. All of the veterans who talk about that day when they came out of the boat, they could see just a line running across the entire width of the beach ahead of them and the flickering flash of the machine guns firing. And they knew their only way of surviving is they had to get to the walls. These were big walls behind that kept the sea out during storms. So there's storm walls that are built into the beach, and they had to get to those. And that's a distance of 200 to 300 to 400 yards, depending on where you came ashore. So that's like a pretty long golf course link, one hole that you've got to run across in deep sand as well. If your shoes are sinking into the sand and you're carrying about 110 pounds of equipment on your back. So it wasn't really a run, it was more like a stumble. And they had to get across that. And you look at that and you think, well, I think everybody's reaction is the same as, my God, how did they do it?
Yeah.
And that's the impression that stays with you. And then you go to Beni-Sumer, the cemetery, where all the Canadians are buried who died that day. And it's an incredibly powerful experience as you walk from one grave to another and see how young they were.
Yeah.
And the little towns they came from. And you just really, you see what a generation did and the courage of that generation.
It's humbling, isn't it?
It really is. And yes, for anyone, if you're in Europe on any kind of trip, do try and find an opportunity to go to not necessarily the one at Juno Beach, but the Commonwealth cemeteries anywhere near where you're traveling, where Canadians are buried, because there's no experience like visiting one of those cemeteries. Everybody I know who's ever gone to a Commonwealth cemetery where the Canadians are buried who is Canadian, they come away with a very different impression of that generation that went away to a war that so many of them didn't come back from.
Folks, the book is Holding Juno. It is jam-packed full of heroic stories of our fighting forces overseas. Mark Zuehlke is the author, of course. If that name is familiar, it should be. He's the author of the award-winning Juno Beach and the Gothic Line. The book can be got at Chapters Indigo right across the country, or the www.brenthollandshow.com website. Click on the book cover, as always, take you right to Chapters Indigo. You order it right online. Mark, I want to ask you, did you have any problems? You had mentioned having some types of problems interviewing veterans. Going back to November, I had tried to interview 3 different veterans I had contacted to come on my show for Remembrance Day. A veteran of the Second World War, a veteran of the Korean War, and a veteran of the Vietnam War. All 3 of them told me the same thing. They said, you young guys are trying to do so right by us, and all we're trying to do is forget it. Have you run it?
Yes, I have had a good number of veterans, especially in the beginning, I should say. When I was first doing research for the book that was Ortona, which was my first book on the Canadian Battle Series, I did have a lot of veterans who turned me down. A lot of them would say, well, it was a long time ago and I just don't remember. And quite a lot of them also said, they didn't want to open up. They had buried this, basically, and they didn't want to open it up again. So there was quite a lot, but there was I think a lot of them talked to me. I think actually you were in a difficult situation because they know it's going to be broadcast. And whereas when they're interviewing me, it can be a very short interview or just a very little thing. They only need to talk about one little thing if that's all they feel comfortable talking about. And so it was a little easier. Interestingly, I had a number of them who, after I had interviewed them, said, I've never talked about the stuff I ended up talking with you today about. I would only tell my family, the funny stories or something like that. And so they then said that they felt really good to have talked about it and to have gone back and remembered that and that it was kind of a release for them. And so that was kind of interesting and nice. That, I'm not just taking away, something actually, they got something out of it as well. is a nice way to feel.
Well, I guess that, Mark, is testament to your authenticity and your honesty to bring these stories forward.
I think so.
You're listening to The Brent Holland Show. For more information on today's guests, as well as free podcasts and downloads, please go to the www.brenthollandshow.com website, www.brenthollandshow.com.
And that's why I say it was harder back when I did Ortona. Now most veterans know of my work now because their families have given them the books or they've come across them themselves. And they know that what I'm trying to do is, that what I'm doing is books that are works of remembrance. I'm not trying to put them in an awkward situation and do for the valor and horror kind of thing that was happening back in the 90s, where, you're making controversy out of their experiences. So they know I'm not doing that. They know they can trust me. And I think that's a big part of it is trust that builds over time.
I agree. Mark, we're going to have to start to wrap up now. What's next for you?
I'm just finishing work on a book called On to Victory, which is the latest installment in what we're now calling the Canadian Battle Series. And it's going to be tracing the last 3 months of the war, particularly looking at the liberation of Holland, which this spring is the 65th anniversary of the end of the war and of the liberation of Holland. And so this book will be coming out in late April, May of this year. And so we're just in the final editing stages on that book. And it's been an incredible story. I thought I knew the story of the Holland liberation, but in researching it, there was so much more story there. And so that'll be coming out in the spring. And then I'm actually returning to Normandy after that to do the Normandy campaign after June 12th, 1944, through to the closing of the Falaise Gap in August. And
Great.
So what I'm doing basically now, my publisher and I decided a couple years ago that having done a number of these books on the Canadian experience of World War II, that we needed to do to cover the entire war, basically, of Canadian Army experience. And so we decided to call it the Canadian Battle Series, and that we would detail each significant battle of World War II. So there's going to be at least 10, possibly 12 books in the series when it's concluded in a few years.
Congratulations. That's fantastic. That's great news. To have a writer of your caliber taking on a project like this, that's fantastic news, I think, for all of Canada. Mark, I have something to ask you also, something I'm not aware of. Did Canadians ever liberate any concentration camps?
Yes.
Oh,
yes,
we did.
Towards the end of the war. Yeah. Now, most of them were prisoner of war camps, so they were Allied troops that were there. But there was one concentration camp in Holland that was a Jewish concentration camp called Westerbork, and the Canadian forces liberated it in April, I think it was April 15th, 1945, April 15th or 17th, I'm just not sure. And they liberated the camp. It had, at that time, approximately 1,500 Jewish people were still in the camp. They hadn't yet been deported to Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen or any of the other death camps in the east. Westerbork had served as a transit camp for moving particularly Dutch Jews east to the death camps. And so Anne Frank, for example, went through Westerbork. In fact, her and her family were the last train that went out of Westerbork going east. If she hadn't been on that train, she would have survived.
My God. You know, several weeks ago, I had the honor to interview Lydia Reich. Lydia Reich is a Holocaust survivor from Bergen-Belsen, and she had actually befriended Anne Frank for several months prior to that. Man, we're so lucky to live here in this country.
That's right.
Folks, we've been speaking with Mark Zuehlke, and I am most appreciative to Mark for not only contributing to Canadian history by writing these books and the great research he's done, but also for coming on the show today. The book is called Holding Juno. If Mark Zuehlke's name is familiar to you, it should be. He's the author of the award-winning Juno Beach and the Gothic Line. His book, of course, can be gotten at any Chapters Indigo right across the country, www.brenthollandshow.com website. Click on the book cover, take you right there to Chapters Indigo, order it from the comfort of your own home. Mark, thank you so much.
Thank you, Brent.
Any parting words? As I said, my demographic is primarily university-age students. Is there anything you would like to leave them with?
I think if, from a perspective of university students, is don't be shy about looking in the discipline that you're involved in, whatever it is you're studying, and look at ways that you could do a project that is a project of remembrance. That you don't have to be a historian. You can be a statistician, could do statistical research on that whole demographic of Canadians who went off to the war as a proportion of all of Canada and stuff. The more we bring our attention to the experiences of that generation that went off to war in 1939 through to 1945, it brings back and reminds us of who we are as a nation. Because I always think of the thing about that generation, particularly something we need to make note of, is they went away to the war, and when they came back, they went away in the Great Depression was on. They went away from a country that was drifting. It was leaderless in many ways, and they came back and they built a society that is the society that we live in today. It was that generation who created the welfare state and actually brought it into being, because they didn't want to see anybody suffer the way they had prior to the war. They also, because of the education program that was put in place at the end of the war, where many veterans could go to university, and many of them would never have had that opportunity. And by having so many go to university at that time, they were able to, we as a nation, created a larger, more sophisticated population than had existed before the war. And that built the industrial and economic society that we live in again today. So you're looking at that generation, they're not just a bunch of old men who gather on November 11th in their Legion suits. They are men and women who came back and built Canada into what it is today. And so we need to remember them not just as soldiers, but as pioneering people.
I can't think of a better way to finish it. And I want to thank you so much, Mark, for coming on today. It's been a great pleasure.
Very much.
Thank you, Mark.
Just to talk to you. You take care.
Take care, my friend.
Okay.
Bye. Bye.
I want to personally thank Mark Zuehlke for joining us this afternoon and bringing to the forefront these important, essential stories of everyday Canadians. They are the reason we can have a life in beautiful, free Canada. Next week, Living History. See you next time.